I've consolidated all the information you need to know about the conflicts and wars happening around the world in 2023. For the first time in 6 years, the world has more armed conflict than the year prior, and we'll see many of these hotspots are interconnected in ways you might not expect. A lot of what I discovered surprised me, so let's jump straight into it. In 2011, what started as protests against President Assad's regime quickly exploded into a full-on war between the Syrian government forces and rebel groups. The Syrian government was backed by Russia and Iran with military support, while the rebels were backed by the United States and their allies. Or another way to put it would be this was a cluster that's absolutely FUBAR. As of 2023, the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, is now in control of 70% of the nation's territory. He regained that territory thanks in large part to the support of Iran and Russia's military. This has led to Syria's rehabilitation in some parts of the world community. The Arab League, for example, has reinstated Syria after a 12-year suspension, which means al-Assad is less isolated. The economic sanctions that have been leveled against his war-torn country has made him so isolated that large parts of the nation's economy has become a narco state. The Syrian military has earned large sums of money selling and exporting amphetamines that are nicknamed the poor man's coke. This feels like the reverse of what we normally hear. Instead of former soldiers leaving to go run a cartel, we have the actual military turning into a drug operation. ANI News claimed that it has become the primary lifeline of the country's economy. They reported it generates 90% of Syria's foreign currency. It's gotten so bad that Syria earned $57 billion in illegal pills trade. ANI states that that's 3 times what the Mexican cartel's revenue is supposed to be. This is a case of weaponized drugs. What I mean by that is Syria's president Bashar al-Assad could use his control of the production of these illicit pills as leverage against his neighbors. He could negotiate to lower the export of the addictive substances as a favor to nearby countries like Saudi Arabia that are facing an influx of these drugs. Nations have all kinds of ways to create instability in their neighboring countries. On the plus side though, for now, it seems like ISIS terrorist forces inside Syria have been seriously weakened over the past few years. At its peak, the CIA stated in 2014 that ISIS had about 31,000 fighters at their disposal, and that number is now as low as 2,000 according to estimates. In fact, according to criticalthreats.org, Catherine Zimmerman and Nathan Vincent wrote a great article there about how ISIS in Syria has had to restructure their entire command network to go back into hiding. Just stay home, ISIS, you've had enough already. Why is ISIS still a threat though? Well, there's about 10,000 ISIS fighters held in detention facilities throughout Iraq and Syria. This unresolved aspect from the war against ISIS has been a persistent problem. It's not as simple as just releasing the ISIS fighters back into the wild though, because many of those fighters come from foreign countries who aren't exactly stoked to have them return back home. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported that 600,000 people have died in Syria since the beginning of the conflict in 2011. 5.4 million refugees live abroad, the majority in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, with a smaller number in Europe. But next up is Mexico. Mexico is a strong partner of the United States. The two economies are closely tied together at the hip. What happens to one affects the other for better or for worse. Cartel violence has left an estimated 30,000 people dead annually since 2018. The Council on Foreign Relations outlined how the state has also been responsible for many of the human rights violations during their war against the cartels. This crisis is another one of the factors contributing to a migration crisis in the United States. In fact, there were 2.5 million encounters of migrants recorded at the US-Mexico border in 2023. The Migration Policy Institute states that's a new historic high. This influx of people has put a strain on America's infrastructure and their ability to handle the migration, which has tragically led to people sleeping on streets and not being properly cared for. The most recent developments include the fact that Mexico's Congress passed a reform in August 2022 that allows the military to carry out domestic law enforcement until 2028. That is absolutely shocking. Let that sink in. Think about it. If you had the military every day on the street corner policing you, the reason it has consequences for regular citizens is because when military forces are given a domestic police mission, what we tend to see is increased cases of abuse of power. Human rights groups claim that's exactly what we're starting to see because the Mexican military police have started to erode the treatment of their civilians. The Council on Foreign Relations reported that Mexican citizens have lost their rights in many cases and face arbitrary detention and extrajudicial killings. Journalists often face targeted assassinations inside Mexico. Even several YouTubers have been taken out by Mexican cartels for saying the wrong things. The government of Mexico is increasingly militarizing their control of civilian infrastructure, even announcing in June 2023 that they would give control of Mexico's airport to their Navy. Military searches make the TSA look non-invasive, so Mexico's authorities appear to be cracking down on the cartel threat in some areas. However, Reuters reported 95% of the raids on drug labs were against inactive old labs. Why would that be the case? Reuters spoke to 4 traffickers who said the cartel bribes Mexican army commanders to raid their old labs and keep their active ones safe. This has led to people in the United States starting to question at what point does the violence become bad enough that the US needs to take some kind of action to curb it, and this remains to be seen. But let's go a little bit east to the country of Haiti. It has 11.5 million people. They're located on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. Geographically, Haiti is positioned between the Caribbean Sea to the south and the Atlantic Ocean to the north. The country is beautiful, and yet tragically, it's the poorest in the Western Hemisphere. At its closest point, it's 700 miles away from the United States. Since the mid-20th century, there's been a rise in political instability and all kinds of natural disasters that have pushed migration from Haiti to the close proximity United States. For example, in 2022, there were over 700,000 Haitian immigrants living in the US. They are the top nationality for people who make the dangerous journey to the US through South America. The reason for these people fleeing Haiti is because of recent developments here that are shocking. In 2021, a group of armed men from a gang assassinated the president Moïse. That'd be like if the Bloods or the Crips took out the US president. Following the assassination, the country collapsed into chaos. Basic government functions shut down, and widespread gang violence rose. Over the past year, in 2023, gang violence soared by 80% in their capital city, where gangs control 60% of the territory. Gangs are now fighting each other for control of the country in Haiti. Even the nation's proverbs signal how much struggle they've been through. One in particular stuck out to me, and it goes like this: "Really bad is not yet dead." And what that conveys is the resilience and the belief that things can get better for the people of Haiti despite the current difficulties. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, the powerful gangs have essentially become the de facto authority, especially in the capital. In fact, these gangs even control much of the nation's economic levers. A coalition of the 9 largest gangs in Haiti are known as the G9, and they successfully blockaded Haiti's largest fuel terminal in 2021. This place is responsible for 70% of the country's gas. They then made some absurd, crazy demands, asking for the resignation of the prime minister, who was like, no way. The report goes on to state over 2,400 Haitian citizens have been killed and abducted within 8-month span, leading to vigilantes attempting to take control of the law into their own hands in Haiti. In response, in October 2023, the United Nations Security Council finally approved a multinational security force, led by the Kenyans, to help the Haitian police counter the gang violence. Police are hurting so badly that 6,000 officers have quit. It's nearly half of their total force. The United Nations resolution drafted by the US and Ecuador essentially authorizes the Kenya-led mission of an estimated 1,000 officers to take all necessary measures, which is another way of saying that they can pull triggers and use lethal force to take down the gangs. There's a German phrase that I recently learned that I'm gonna butcher, but it goes like this: Die Lage war immer so ernst, which translates to the sky has always been falling. Even though there is conflict around the world, that doesn't mean the world is becoming a worse place. There are still millions of people working every day towards peace, and this next example shows us how the international community plans to hopefully restore order in one place. Next, we travel to Somalia, Africa. the country of 17 million people that's in absolute chaos right now. According to the UN, the nation is on the brink of famine with 7 million food insecure and 1 million displaced by drought. Meanwhile, the United States and China compete for favor with the nation. The Institute for Security Studies explains Somalia's geopolitical importance this way. Somalia has the longest coastline on the African continent. It's near key waterways for international trade, like the choke point called the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Recent maritime weapon smuggling from Iran to rebels in Yemen transits straight through Somalia. For many years, when people thought of Somalia, they thought of piracy and hijacking of civilian cargo ships, but those instances have seen a steep decline. However, it's been replaced by international arms smuggling, fueling nearby conflict in Yemen. There's been a United Nations arms embargo on Somalia for the past 31 years. Lifting it would let the country acquire new, modern weapons for their police and military security forces. However, there's a major risk that those weapons would fall into the wrong hands. The terror group known as Al-Shabaab has grown here in Somalia since its origins in 2006. Since then, Al-Shabaab has turned into one of the world's richest terrorist organizations by extorting money from locals and stealing money from people at checkpoints and roadblocks. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, this group has capitalized on the weakness of Somalia's central government. Starting in 2007, there has been a United Nations peacekeeping mission largely led by Kenya and Ugandan soldiers. Originally, the force was about 3,000 soldiers strong. At the insurgency peak in 2011, the Al-Shabaab terror group controlled large sections of Somalia's territory, including parts of the capital Mogadishu. In 2010, the UN security mission grew here to 7,200 troops, after an additional battalion from Uganda joined them. The result of that operation was Kenya forces were successfully able to push Al-Shabaab terrorists out of these territories. I'm not sure if you're aware of the level of US military intervention here that aims to keep stability in the region. But since 2007, the US has given Somalia forces more than $500 million to help train and equip them. They've launched frequent drone strikes against terror groups here. Then, in 2022, the US President Joe Biden approved the deployment of hundreds of US special operators on the ground into Somalia. Stability in this country is extremely important to a number of great powers. So the UN peacekeepers have been in Somalia for well over a decade. They're looking now for maybe a way to transition out. 18,000 personnel from the AU transition mission are authorized to stay until the end of 2024. When most people think of Somalia, they think of a single country, when in reality it's closer to two. During the 1800s, the northern section of Somalia was colonized by the British and named Somaliland. In the south, Italy expanded its colonial control into what is now modern-day Somalia. In 1991, Somaliland declared independence from Somalia. In February 2023, Somaliland troops attacked a village situated along the contested border with Somalia and Somaliland, forcing thousands to flee, with hundreds killed or wounded. Another location in Africa that saw a lot of conflict in 2023 was the Sahel region. What happened here is that 6 countries from Guinea in the west to Sudan in the east are now controlled by military juntas. They all came to power in a coup where they overthrew the former government. This led to the French military pulling their forces out of Niger, and on December 22nd, the last French forces boarded planes and left the country after 10 years of fighting against terrorism there. This has left a security vacuum that terrorists are already trying to take advantage of with increased attacks. As we talked about earlier, ISIS was largely destroyed in Syria and Iraq, but their organization is now on the rise inside West Africa. According to multiple sources, in order to try to prevent that from happening, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, all the junta military leaders, anyone who's anyone from the coups, are meeting to try to create a new federation. They want to pool some resources of their own to fight the terrorists in what they're calling the Alliance of Sahel States. Now, I'm an infantryman, not an expert on Africa, so let's see what Nate Allen, an associate professor at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, has to say about it all. He claims that in reality, the partnership is in part an effort to entrench and legitimize their military governments, instead of an effort to stop terrorism, because they have limited capacity to really combat them. But hopefully that's not the case, and they're able to finally stop the growing threat on their own. Next, we travel over to India with a massive population of 1.4 billion people. Apparently India and Canada have beef now. This must be the strangest two countries to have a problem with each other of all time. In September 2023, India suspended all visas to Canada, citing, quote, security threats to its citizens. This is because the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, accused the Indian government of assassinating a Sikh political and religious leader on Canadian soil. This tension comes from long-running separatist movements in Sikh-dominated areas of India's northern Punjab region. India is trying to fight off an internal insurgency. Violence in the Punjab region dates back to Indian independence in 1947. Separatist fighting reached a peak in 1980s, but has since died down. India is a diverse country that relies on a parliamentary democracy to represent a wide range of minority groups. However, a recent rise in Hindu nationalism is fueling a rise in separatist movements as these groups fear losing their representation in India's government. Sikh independence in the north is not the only internal conflict India is managing. Take a look at this religious map of India. Notice the central Hindu population surrounded by a concentration of Christians in India's northeast. In May of 2023, Indian troops were ordered to quote-unquote shoot on sight in response to Kaiku protests in the region. Violence against the Christian minorities appear particularly hard hit, with over 500 churches burned down and destroyed according to local media. However, most of this violence has managed to slip under the radar. It wasn't until day 78 of the fighting that India's Prime Minister Modi publicly addressed the ethnic conflict. According to the BBC, the Indian government has deployed 40,000 soldiers, paramilitary troops, and police to the region. Hopefully this influx of state troops can help re-establish security in the region and restore a sense of normalcy. It's important to note this region is facing increased violence. India, Pakistan, and China all have their border disputes here and are dealing with an increased level of terrorism now that the Taliban is in control of Afghanistan. We talked earlier about how ISIS was destroyed in Iraq and Syria, but they are reportedly popping up like whack-a-moles in Afghanistan, where they have a safe haven now. According to a 2023 Pentagon assessment, the Islamic State is now using Afghanistan as a headquarters to coordinate attacks not just in Afghanistan but around the world. So that begs the question, what has been happening in Afghanistan since the Taliban took over? Are they having fun with the bureaucratic process of governing Afghanistan? In November 2023, the Taliban brought a whole slew of radical laws that ban women from going to public parks, universities, or gyms. And by radical, I mean extremist. Now you might think the Taliban and ISIS are besties, but in actuality, they're actually sworn enemies. We don't have to get too much in the weeds here, but basically the Taliban and ISIS have very different ideological beliefs. Sometimes the irony is too much for me. The Taliban, who was an insurgency for 20 years, is now dealing with and trying to stop an insurgency of ISIS, and they're doing it with weapons and vehicles that the United States military left behind. Moving on to Myanmar, a country bordering China with 53 million people. Did you know that Myanmar is technically the longest running armed conflict in the world? While fighting in the country formerly known as Burma has short periods of relative stability, no government has governed the entirety of Burma since 1941. On November 28, 2023, opposition forces to Myanmar's current junta vowed that it was the beginning of the end for their military dictatorship. Why does this conflict matter to you wherever you live? On the geopolitical scale, Myanmar shares a border with China. The stability of Myanmar is of the utmost interest to China. Due to their economic and strategic investments here, China has invested significantly in the infrastructure projects in Myanmar, some of which are designed to limit their vulnerabilities to oil imports. What happens here is important to keep an eye on. In February 2021, Myanmar's military ousted the democratically elected government in a coup d'etat set to cardio dance music. Since then, a loose collection of rebel groups have struggled to retake Myanmar from the military. Some of the most prominent groups include pro-democracy guerrillas. Take a look at this conflict event tracker. Despite the conflict continuing into its fourth year, the map shows a steady growth in intensity. One reason behind the recent changes is that these pro-democracy rebel groups may have found an unlikely friend: China. Myanmar rebels have used their recent gains in the border areas between Myanmar and China to crack down hard on illegal scam and online gambling operations that have plagued Chinese authorities for years. When the coup happened, some suspected China of supporting the junta to prevent Myanmar's democracy from creating links to the West. However, an article published in Foreign Policy magazine argues that returning a democracy to Myanmar could give China a more reliable economic partner. The recent state loss of the border area between China and Myanmar to rebel groups means that to curb the incessant scamming and online gambling syndicates, China will now have to work with rebels rather than the official government. It's a big deal when the biggest kid on the playground is now working with the other team. As the junta continues to lose control on the ground in Myanmar, their forces are now taking to the sky. November saw a 7-fold increase in civilian deaths from increased airstrikes. Reports put 2023 as the deadliest year for civilians, with an estimated 8,640 losing their life over the course of the conflict. These deaths will likely only further alienate the regime and attract new fighters to the rebel cause. There are 3 prominent rebel groups in Myanmar. Together they form the Three Brotherhood Alliance. However, this alliance is only part of the roughly 39 different insurgencies that are fighting against the junta. Like other insurgencies in New Guinea and Syria, this wide variety of groups, all with their own agendas, means that even if the junta are successfully overthrown, there is still a high likelihood that the country will still not find complete stability. However, unlike Syria and New Guinea, Myanmar does have some history with democracy. What this means is there's hope that if rebel forces are successful, they can find a way to work together to share power through a coalition of government, rather than turn towards fighting each other. Moving west to Armenia and Azerbaijan, why does the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan matter to the rest of the world? Before a few years ago, I couldn't find the place on a map, yet it's actually a strategically important location. These 2 countries border some of the most influential nations in the world, like Iran, Turkey, and Russia. There are plans to potentially build a new massive shipping route from China that extends through here. This route would circumvent the normal one that goes through Russia. A lot is at stake here, a lot more than some people realize. The Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict over the semi-autonomous Nagorno-Karabakh region began in February of 1988. This is a region that lies inside of Azerbaijan, but it's historically made up of Armenians. The first conflict occurred when Azerbaijan declared independence from the Soviet Union, and Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh voted to separate from Azerbaijan in order to stay. The war ended in a stalemate in 1994 when Azerbaijan failed to kick the Armenians out. Low-level ethnic clashes over elections and power persisted from 2008 until it reached a tipping point in 2020. The Second Nagorno-Karabakh War is an underrated turning point in modern warfare. Preceding the war in Ukraine, the use of drones, coordinated artillery fire, and small drone tactics gave Azerbaijan a tech-savvy edge in the fighting. Azerbaijan drones supplied by Turkey were so effective against Armenian armor that the debate on the death of the tank as a battlefield asset began circulating the internet. Social media and influencing campaigns also played a pivotal role in shaping the narrative to garner outside support during the fighting. At the end of the fighting, both sides lost around 2,000 to 3,000 fighters, but Nagorno-Karabakh held on to its sovereignty. What a lot of armchair generals didn't account for is the fact that Azerbaijan has recently become rich with newly exploited oil resources. Azerbaijan was able to invest billions of additional dollars into their military that Armenia was not able to keep up with. Azerbaijan made $35 billion from BP since 2020. This all happened when they completed the BTC pipeline. The BTC pipeline officially became operational in 2006. It's no coincidence that Azerbaijan's military spending more than doubled starting in 2005. Drones made a huge difference, but when we look at the numbers, Armenia got outspent by Azerbaijan on defense by a factor of more than 4 annually. In 2023, the final shots of a 35-year-old conflict finally rang, or at least the final shots for now. On the 19th of September 2023, Azerbaijan launched a major military attack on the Nagorno-Karabakh region. Azerbaijan forces struck hard and fast, with infantry moving under the cover of heavy artillery barrage. By the end of the day, Reuters reported that Azerbaijan forces seized more than 60 military posts and destroyed up to 20 military vehicles with other hardware. Authorities reported 25 killed, including 2 civilians and over 100 injured during the fighting. That night, the civilians of Nagorno-Karabakh settled in for another uncertain bout of fighting. However, the very next day, Russia brought both sides together to sign a ceasefire agreement. On September 21st, Azerbaijan announced that it had taken full control of the Nagorno-Karabakh region, and Russian peacekeepers began facilitating the exodus of more than 100,000 ethnic Armenian residents from their homes. Under the terms of the ceasefire, the government of Nagorno-Karabakh agreed to completely disband their armed forces. In all, the conflict over this 1,700 square mile piece of earth cost somewhere around 50,000 lives over the course of 35 years. This is Sunik, a small province in Armenia along the southern border with Azerbaijan. In the wake of Armenia's defeat, members of the European Union are now investing over $100 million into developing Armenia's most rural area. This investment is designed to deter Azerbaijan from capitalizing off its recent victory by seizing this Armenian border territory. After clearly losing at Russia's negotiating table, the country that once fought to stay a part of the Soviet Union is now looking westward for more allies to help protect its sovereignty. It's hard to deny the leverage that Turkish drones and Turkish political support played in helping Azerbaijan secure its victory. However, despite Turkey being a NATO power, this does not mean that the United States is fully behind Azerbaijan too. In the wake of the September ceasefire, the US State Department has largely kept quiet, refusing to take sides. Evidence of serious human rights abuses done by authoritarian Azerbaijan against democratic Armenia may eventually influence the United States to support the latter, despite its historically close ties with Russia. Let's move on to Indonesia. The massive nation has a population of 273 million people. It's strategically situated between the Indian and Pacific Ocean, with the equator running straight through the middle of the country. Indonesia is considered by many experts to be one of the last remaining swing countries whose alliance could swing the balance of power in the favor of the United States or China. However, the country has its own share of domestic conflict. This is Philip Martins, a New Zealand native and pilot for Susi Air, an Indonesian airline. In February 2023, Philip was flying to a remote part of West Papua New Guinea when a rebel group ambushed his plane, burned it to ashes, and took Philip hostage. Today, Philip remains captive deep in the jungles of New Guinea. He's been unwillingly conscripted as a bargaining chip for the world's most dystopian low-level insurgency, known as the West Papua National Liberation Army. Just flying the flag of the Free Papua movement openly in Indonesia can land you 15 years in jail. That's how seriously the insurgency is taken. But why does everyone want New Guinea? In the 1960s, Indonesia fought to absorb former Dutch colonies in the region for access to more natural resources located there. The United Nations transferred control of the western half of the island to Indonesia. Afterwards, Indonesia then flooded the island with workers to take advantage of its natural resources. Meanwhile, many of the local inhabitants remain jobless, and so ever since then, insurgent action in the hills always existed. However, in 2018, violence exploded when a massacre here left 24 Indonesian construction workers dead. Then, in April of 2021, Indonesia's West Papua intelligence chief was killed in an ambush while on patrol, which would be like a high-level CIA officer getting taken out. The Indonesian military, in response, launched a coordinated attack on several villages. Indonesian forces are considered a key US partner in the region, which is why you'll see them armed with some of the latest hardware to help deter China. This means they well outarm the Free Papua movement, who routinely fights with bows and arrows. In 2023, the war in Ukraine entered a new stage, where the counteroffensive appears to have culminated. Neither Ukraine nor Russia gained significant territory in this year. Russia controls a net gain of 188 square miles more territory than they did at the start of the year. That means Ukraine gained 143 and Russia gained 331. This has led to concerns that the conflict may have entered a stalemate. This isn't necessarily a guarantee, and we could see different results next year, but the reason it's a concern is because people are worried Western support for Ukraine will slow down. According to the New York Times, losses between both sides are nearing 500,000. As it stands today, Russia controls 18% of Ukrainian territory. Ukrainian President Zelensky has called on the entire nation to support the construction of new defensive lines, which would mean the front line may stay this way for a while. On October 7th, Israel was struck with an attack by Hamas, sparking major armed conflict between the two groups. Over 1,330 Israelis have died since the October 7th awful attack. Israel launched a ground campaign in response into the Gaza Strip, and that started on October 28, 2023, with the goal of destroying and dismantling Hamas as an organization. As of December 12th, they've secured the majority of the northern half of Gaza and are working their way south, rooting out Hamas fighters where they find them. The campaign has raised humanitarian concerns for the Palestinian people trapped inside Gaza, many of whom are unable to escape the war. Iran has their proxy groups in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. The risk is that these groups will open up new fronts against Israel and expand the war into a regional one. In response to the ground campaign in Gaza, Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen have held civilian ship vessels hostage and hit them with guided missiles. The concern here is that insurance companies will raise their rates on cargo ships. Companies will no longer be able to pay for the insurance to travel through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, and will instead have to travel the long way around the Horn of Africa. That's the 2023 conflict catch-up. If you found this new format of video informative or valuable, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button. It helps let the algorithm know that you want to see more kinds of reports like this. Hopefully 2024 will see a decrease in the concerning trend of rising conflicts. I'm your average infantryman, Cappy. Thank you for watching, Spare Parts Army.